like 2 different kinds of projects, and one is a structural intervention that UT has done to try and promote success for students. And the second one is work that David Yeager is doing with collaboration. So, like, the whole second half of that article the stuff that is the complement from Stanford for the stuff they talk about in the yeah, such important things.
Yeah.
Ended up flying with their laptop for the guys at Snarky Responses. Yeah, it changed the structural art. Like, we think what you're doing is important. I don't even know actually, it doesn't have to be a threat. Right. And are we waiting for another speaker?
She just wrote that's into a chat.
I'm sorry?
That's in the chat.
Oh, cool.
Yes. It's just not exactly.
It's a little, it's not easy to get to. So
maybe wait a couple minutes.
I would,
Okay, sure.
It's up to you, whatever you want.
No, that's a good idea.
I wouldn't be surprised if you just had that.
Yes. Yes. Okay, sure. Let me sorry about that. I'm just thinking portion of people who make it down there, this portion will just
Come back and nice to meet you.
Okay, so thanks everyone for coming. I think you know what session you're attending, and hopefully you might be interested in finding out why we're enthusiastic about the opportunities that digital resources provide for doing research in real-world contexts. One thing I'm going to mention, just in the spirit of using digital resources to improve learning and dissemination of knowledge, is there's actually a link here to a Google document, so tiny.cc/symposium behavior online. So you can go there now, you can go there later. But the idea is that we're all going to talk, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say. People are going to make points. But this is a way that the slides, we can put them up there. There's a screencast we're making now, and you can access that later. And also, all those burning questions that you're always disappointed you never get to ask, just type them into that doc, and our discussants can keep an eye on them and raise them. Or at least you know they've been asked, and we can all look at that later. Okay. So in terms of thinking about the motivation for the kind of work that's going to be presented in this general approach, is that one thing that's really clear in the last 10, 20 years is that digital resources, especially digital resources linked to the internet, are playing a bigger role in everyone's life. How many people here have smartphones, have computers? Even if you're fighting the resistance of a smartphone, children and friends do have one. And the interesting thing is this is actually taking an increasing amount of behavior out of the physical world and into a digital environment. A digital environment where we have a lot of affordances for collecting data and conducting experiments. So to give you an example from the context of learning, which is a setting that I think about a lot as a cognitive scientist, the simple change from a student doing homework, math homework on a pen and paper, to them doing that exact same homework, let's say on an online website, where they're now typing answers. It's pretty simple. You might not even think about it much, but it actually has pretty profound consequences for being able to do research and actually connecting us to that real-world environment. What I see a digital resource like a smartphone app that can upload data back to a server or has randomization enabled in it, or a website that offers math exercises or the ability to have people interact socially, is that it basically is bridging two contexts that are normally pretty far apart. One is a lab environment, and the other is a student classroom or any other real-world setting where people are doing everyday behavior. As psychologists, we've always been really interested in actually just understanding learning or reasoning or social interactions, self-concepts, but we often use lab environments because they're previously the only place we can get the kinds of tools we need. But when you have a digital environment that's set up in the right way, you can actually get, in a way, the best of both worlds. You can have the ability to randomize people to different conditions, show them different versions of an exercise, or have different ways of structuring an interaction. you got control and precision in at least how something's delivered, even if people vary in their response. And for me, the most important thing is actually you can now start to make statements about whether the theories and hypotheses and principles we draw actually generalize. When I think about learning, that's a term that has a very broad scope. It can refer to paired associate learning, it can refer to memorizing lists of words, it can refer to learning from this talk or learning in a classroom. If we can conduct experiments in these environments, we can actually start to test the scope of those generalizations and really be able to characterize real-world learning. On the other hand, we've also got practical benefits. We can make improvements. We actually have to grapple with these authentic real-world problems. And the interesting thing is that the result of research now is not just an insight that might be in a journal paper or communicated in a conference like this. It's actually implemented in a resource. So if you do an experiment where you change an application or if you change a way of having people interact through a website, what's left afterwards, your control condition might be what was there before, but one of your experimental conditions can actually be a better product. And this isn't just practically useful, it's also actually getting at some of the benefits of computational modeling. What really appeals to us about models is that we're able to instantiate principles we normally express verbally about relationships between independent and dependent variables or hypothesized mechanisms in actual entities that we can formalize and specify exactly how they interact. If I specify some hypothesis I have about how a motivational message helps learning inside of an online exercise, that's actually spelled out in that context. Exactly all the implicit commitments I have about what's going to be effective and when. So the way, hopefully what will come out of these talks is really that there's a set of interesting research questions we have, and there's a set of interesting research questions we have that we can ask about real-world contexts. And I think that online technology really helps identify the intersection of this set and work on those. And that's the sort of approach I'm really trying to take, and I think many people here have as well. Okay. So in terms of the particular talk I'll give, I'm going to talk about online resources for learning. Everything from going on your smartphone to learn vocabulary, to students using Google Documents in class, to math exercises on a website. And this is just because it's the area I focused on the most. I'm really interested in other contexts, and I think a lot of these principles apply there as well. So how many people have heard of massive open online courses? Okay. So basically, the abbreviation is MOOCs. I'm going to start throwing on the word MOOC left and right, because sadly, being in one environment where you work on things, you start to think everyone knows it. But just as a heads up, basically, Stanford, MIT, Harvard, and a growing large number of universities have started to offer these free online courses where there's a platform. The main ones are edX and Coursera. And professors put up videos on this platform, and it's just a free course open to anyone in the world. So basically, you can just go to edX.org, Coursera.org, and start leafing through courses. The reason this is really interesting is because this is an example of a free online resource that is basically now having more and more people doing the kinds of real-world activities they would normally do in a classroom in a digital environment that's been set up to some extent by academics, and we can actually start embedding experiments. Khan Academy, how many people have heard of that? It's often used for school-age learning, and they've got a lot of content like videos. But increasingly, there are things like math exercises, which are really important from a psychological perspective because you're actually collecting data. Assistance.org is another platform that's actually being created by Neil Heffernan, and he's a researcher, so it's actually built for a research approach first. So it's practical, but it allows you to embed experiments inside of it for all kinds of interactions with exercises. So one thing that you might have realized for now is it might be hard to follow my accent, and I apologize for that. All the accent training I've done has not removed it, which makes it tough for you. Well, I haven't done that much. Okay, so I'm originally from Trinidad, so don't feel bad at any point to ask me to slow down or speak more clearly. So what I'm really going to present very quickly. Oh, yes.
Can you tell us the TinyCC?
Yes, which was for, oh, yeah, sure, sorry. The Tiny.cc, 3 words, symposium, behavior, online.
And while we're paused, there are a number of open seats at the front. If people who don't have a seat back there want to come up, please feel free to walk in and grab a seat.
Thanks. So I'm going to give a bit of a whirlwind tour of some experiments that have been done or in progress. And what I'm really interested in is kind of thinking what experimental paradigms we can identify that allow us to research on real-world learning. So how many people have come across, know why I refer to Drosophila? So Drosophila is that fruit fly that all the biological researchers have just milked to death, well, literally to death in many cases. But it's basically a organism that has a great set of genes for doing a certain kind of biological research. And so I'm trying to think, not just what is the experiment I want to do tomorrow or next year, but what are experiment paradigms where we can all think about re-asking our research questions in those contexts. So we can both get the issues we want to get, but also be able to partner with these platforms. I mean, I'm just one person, but there are lots of much smarter people than me here at this conference. It'd be great to be able to think of how we can actually leverage a lot of that research in real-world environments. Okay, so after thinking about this the last couple of years, what I've tried to think about is, instead of MOOCs, these massive open online courses, maybe we could focus instead on something like a MOOClet. So it's a modular online resource, like a piece of a MOOC, like an exercise or a lesson. And you can sort of think of your own example, math exercise, video lesson. I think Lindsay's going to talk about a few of those. And if maybe I can interpret some of what Shannon's presenting in that way, but there's a pretty broad space interventions. And so here's some more information just outlining the kind of thinking about that. And I'd be really curious to get people's thoughts. This is a sort of meeting thinking about how we can embed psychological research in these resources. Concretely, what this means is that you can just get a mailing list or you can participate remotely. But basically what this means is Stanford has a platform. edX, they use an open version of it. And what we're trying to do is actually put up some resources like learning how to do a statistical test. But the main function of this is not to have a gigantic course, but to have one targeted module or three where people can actually think of embedding their research. So we can do randomization, collect data, make it immediately available. So I'd be happy to hear people's thoughts. And you'd be surprised. Well, I mean, psychologists created experimental design, but it's kind of amazing the ways you can kind of maybe change a research question or kind of slide it into something that you wouldn't have thought, like a statistics exercise. You can ask questions about motivation and social interaction in terms of behaviors of students around discussing them. And this is just a sort of workshop paper that outlines some of the ways you can do randomized experiments in these online environments, what you can change and can't change. So here's one bridging experiment paradigm that's really come out of thinking about MOOClets. And this is an online math exercise. So this one is actually from Khan Academy. If you look at their website, khanacademy.org, they've got hundreds of these exercises from adding and subtracting all the way up to university level in calculus. And every one of them takes this basic form. You see a statement of a problem. So the grades on this history midterm are normally distributed, mean of 82 and standard deviation of 5, perseverance 69. So can you find a z-score? So you could make an attempt to type in an answer. And if you get it correct, you go on to the next exercise. And the next exercise might be at the same kind, where they just change the numbers and spin it up back at you. Or it might be a completely different kind. You might progress on to another concept in statistics. So you have this paradigm of people doing these over and over. If you don't get it right, you are just told that. You have to keep on trying, keep on trying. So we're logging how many attempts you will make, sort of how well they understand. If you eventually just aren't making progress, so even if you just, from the first time you see it, you just get lazy, you can actually ask for a hint. So if you click that button, show solution, it's going to show you the first step of a worked out solution. So for example, definition of z-score, click it again. They actually start around the formula. And at this point, you might solve it and go forward, in which case we know how many hints you need to solve it. Or you might just have to keep on going until you reach what's called the bottom out hints. You just get the answer, you type it in, and then you can go forward. So we're collecting a nice set of measures here from repeated behavior, accuracy, how long they take, how many hints they need, and how many attempts they make. The interesting thing about this is it actually maps kind of closely onto paradigms in cognitive psychology about learning categories, where you're shown examples of positive and negative examples of a category, A, B, or C. This is now dealing a bit more with right or wrong exercises. And that's what really jumped out at me about this. Now, in terms of it being a paradigm, though, what can we actually experiment with? So what are these sort of malleable factors that the way Institute of Education Sciences talks about it, that we can actually change? So it may look very simple, but actually it took a lot of thinking to figure out exactly what is technically easy and what works well. And basically showing text above here. So now, one thing I would ask you is, how could you ask your psychological question in terms of just changing text on a page? It's a pretty simple thing, but actually text saying language to another person kind of encapsulates almost all of our interactions. Oh, sorry, a large part. And so the basic paradigm here is that's what we're measuring, and here's actually what we're randomizing. So here's the first line of work to try to look at questions in this context. And this is in collaboration with Carol Dweck's group, Dave Parnescu, Ben Healy, and Joshua Soldick, who's Harvard Khan Academy and Harvard Stanford. So this is drawing on decades of research by Carol Dweck and others on whether intelligence being malleable or fixed predicts and has a big impact on students' behavior. The question here that they've started moving towards and that we're asking here is how to teach a growth mindset. The theoretical question here is whether it's merely positive. To what extent can you say that teaching a growth mindset is about teaching students intelligence is malleable versus giving them encouragement more generally? And that's the sort of scientific questions being asked. So what we did is actually embed, you can kind of imagine, how do we convert that pretty broad issue that's normally involved at least hour-long experiments, if not 8-week interventions, into this paradigm? Well, you just actually stick a message above this. So practice usually where just what they're doing before. Growth mindset message says, well, remember, the more you practice, the smarter you become. So here's the fixed experimental comparison, and that's Joshua. Between practice usual and different growth mindset messages, we had about 14 of them in all. And this is embedded in Khan Academy's website for about 2 months on 12 different kinds of fraction exercises. So were people more motivated? I'm going to start going very quickly, sorry, just so that I don't make people lose out on time. But basically, what we found is actually there is a reliable effect on students attempting more problems. It's pretty small, but we don't actually know how many people looked at these problems. If we did this in a lab context, the effect might be a lot bigger because we just have more motivated students and we have a much more homogeneous population. It also actually increased how accurate they were. So just seeing these messages made people do better. Now, in terms of interpreting, you could just say, well, that's obvious. You put these messages up, people did better. You might also just be skeptical, well, anything is statistically significant with 200,000 students, right? So here's a second comparison, which actually was run at the same time. We compared the growth mindset message to a positive message. So this would be something like, some of these problems are hard, so do your best. And so the important thing here is that they're both, this is controlled for having a message pop up at you. And the reason I mention it as positive is because it's encouraging. It's communicating some kind of affect. So what's the effect of these positive messages? Actually, they're not better than showing nothing at all. So not anything is significant with that many students. The growth mindset is still doing substantially better. I'm going to go over this quickly. Adults don't see any differences between these messages. And in ongoing research, we're looking at, or on assessments, we're looking at, because that's different affordances, whether messages are more effective when you get them only when you make a mistake, instead of just a broad-based kind of blast. So you might ask, can we do anything more sophisticated than messages with just text? And actually, you can in a pretty simple way. So this is another experiment with Joshua, where we just had a clickable link. So click here to learn about the what, why, how strategy. And when you click on that, which honestly most students probably didn't for a very long time, if ever, you get it popped down and it says, well, to use this strategy, ask yourself these questions after each hint and problem. What does this step mean to you? Why is it helpful to take the step, or how do you know it's right? You can actually imagine using this sort of basic technique. Have a link that doesn't force information in people's face, but let them click on it so they can request it. And that's how you can actually pack something as rich and complicated as strategy training into actually just a piece of text. Other pretty innovative things that I think Shannon may talk about is a link could be a hyperlink. So the point of the internet is that you can point to any resource very easily. So you can actually just randomize what link someone's pushed to, and that can actually be a way to, again, pack something pretty heavy into a small, I guess, lever. So those messages are pretty simple, but they're actually based on a fair bit of research. So my background is actually first in prompting people to explain and understanding, just from cognitive psychology perspective, what is it about asking expectations that helps learning. But to do that intervention, I actually compared it with a lot of work on learning strategies, and in particular, work that comes out of education psychology. And actually, there's a lot of really interesting work in how and behavior change on that. So we actually ran 4 different kinds of intervention, and in total, there were about 16 conditions. Doing experiments in these environments, you actually have to kind of rethink how you normally run experiments, because it really doesn't make sense sometimes to just do normal 3 3, 4 conditions, 1 and 2 factors. So right now the results are pretty preliminary, but what we are finding is that even if we just put on one exercise, where students do about 2 to 5 problems, we are getting a significant effect, about 1% increase in accuracy for that learning strategy training versus nothing at all. It's not differing significantly from just prompting people with a more generic prompt, but it looks like the trend is there. So once we actually get more data, I think that'll be reliable. We've actually rolled this now out across the full site of exercises on Khan Academy. And another question we're asking is how motivation and metacognition might interact. So actually, simply by randomizing whether they get, so you can imagine a condition that's just the mindset messages, just the clickable link, and one way actually we randomly give them either or. So essentially they're getting both of them just by alternating which one comes on a question. And so we're actually looking now whether there might be synergistic interactions between those. Now in terms of paradigm, in an online course, which looks like this actually scales up quite well. You can imagine just putting a message of choice here. And I don't think these messages are really as sophisticated. I'm sure if we were to put together everyone's head here, there'd be a super message that'd be a lot better than one I've come up with. Another experiment that's in progress, and maybe another kind of paradigm, is actually showing a video at the beginning of a course. And here we would show a mindset video, we'd show a text version, we'd show a mindset message from someone else, a positive encouraging video, and it's not quite fair to call that belonging, but it's a bit adapted from work by Jeff Cohen. And so this is now a structure that's a bit more like a randomized control trial. Show the very beginning, and then look at the students' behavior across the entire course. Okay, so that's just a quick taste of this, and it's been pretty tough for me to figure out exactly how to do research in all these settings, and I don't believe in wasted work, so I'm happy to share resources that might be useful to people if they're interested in kind of work. I feel like psychologists have a huge amount to add to this space, and it'd be really exciting to see if you can pair lab experiments and MTech experiments with experiments that are actually embed in these settings. So those are the resources I put up on my website, and feel free to contact me. And in particular, I'm part of a grant with Neil Heffernan, where he's actually allowing psychologists to embed experiments in setting of assessments. There's a huge space of technology and funding, which also is quite exciting, and I'd be happy to share about. And if you want to be involved in MOOClets, you can see if you can somewhat squeeze your question into that context. Right? So thanks so much. Do you actually, I think you have your slides in, see, I can change them. Oh yeah, sure. Give me a check this right here. It's just fine.
Oh.
Does anyone have any questions while Lindsay sets up? You can always write them in the Google Doc, tiny.cc/symposium behavior online.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to talk today about digital video and using them in ecologically valid experimental investigations. And I'm looking for the right term, but anyway, one of these days I'll think of it. Maybe some of you will have some idea. I'm trying to address this overarching challenge, which is that, you know, there are many ways where minimal transmission has been, you know, sort of conducted from psychological data to classroom teaching, right? We have lots of great knowledge about how learning happens, and not that much of it is made it into the classroom. And, you know, we ask, why not? Well, there are, I think, a number of reasons. One is that labs are not like the real world. This is a video screen grab from my lab where I'm having a little, you know, young child describe something to a blindfolded moose. That doesn't fly in the classroom, right? Everything is much more complex, and you know, you have sort of all this color and things on the walls, and you know, just many different children nearby. So you have all these sort of complex, highly variable contexts, and they may be doing something more important than just diluting their effect. Maybe they're actually doing something really important cognitively, sort of having multiple resources at work simultaneously. So digital media and the internet may provide methodological leverage here in order to actually use experimental rigor in these classroom contexts. Because one option is to say, you know, there's just so much going on in classrooms, it's really impossible to do the sort of careful experimentation that we want to do in order to really test out sort of mechanisms and the sorts of things that we care about here. And specific, though, I'd argue that digital video provides us a real point that's kind of an in-between. And so editing and streaming manipulations of dynamic classrooms can be used as experimental stimuli quite productively, I think. So I'm going to give now an example, which is some research that we've been doing, but I'm really going to highlight the methodology here. So my real-world problem here is about higher order thinking in classroom STEM, and in particular I'm going to talk about mathematics. There's lots of evidence that U.S. teachers are not adequately teaching flexible, relational, generalizable reasoning in mathematics. So children, come out of school with knowledge, but it's not really flexible and generalizable. So how does one experimentally test strategies for improving relational reasoning in these sort of complex variable contexts with enough precision to inform theory at the level of mechanism? So if we can actually try to understand what is useful about these different interventions, we want to really be precise and careful, and I'm going to talk about digital video. Okay, so I want to rethink the way that we envision mathematics as into thinking about it as a system of relationships that can be grouped, decomposed, manipulated, and otherwise interacted upon. That's my operationalization of what higher order thinking in math would be. That's one of the other steps in moving from classrooms to the lab and vice versa, is actually having specificity in what we're talking about in classrooms. This is as an alternative thinking about mathematics as a set of discrete phenomena to be memorized and applied. So what I mean by this in math, just to give an example, you could have exponential growth. So if a teacher is giving you a model of exponential growth, you might see a relationship among elements of this representation. She gives another representation, and you'd see relationships between elements of this representation, and sort of seeing this larger higher order relational structure provides you with this generalizable higher order relationship, exponential growth in this case. We want to be able to see similarities between representations that appear quite different on the surface. We also want to understand and distinguish differences because sometimes they can be quite meaningful while perceptually very similar. There's lots of evidence that we're not doing this very well. Just give one point, which comes from a research study of community college students. They did lots of research trying to get at how these students who had been successfully, they graduated from high school, right? These are motivated students who opted to go to community college. They're not our top students, but they're really products of our educational system. They asked them to solve this set of problems, and if you look at it for a minute, you're probably doing something, have a guess about what you're doing. 77% of community college students calculated the answer to each one separately, so 10 times 3 and wrote it out, 10 times 13 and wrote out the whole thing. So this suggests that they're not seeing math as something that is sort of a relational structure where you can think about, use one problem to solve another one. And when you ask why, not about this problem actually, but about other ones, they'd say things like, I don't know why it's done like that, it's just the way I was taught to do, and I always did it like that. I don't know the answer to that, though. So they don't think about math as something you can reason about. So this is something that we're really organizing now. So I think in order to make relational thinking in classrooms more possible, we want to reorganize the way we think about math and to envision it as a system of relationships. But drawing on the cognitive literature on relational thinking, we can also say what else might be going on here. One is adequate prerequisite knowledge. So without adequate knowledge, people can't do analogies, they can't do relational thinking. Also, executive function plays a crucial role here. So in order to disattend to sort of object features and then preferentially attend to relational information requires inhibitory control, and holding multiple relations and elements of the representations in mind requires working memory. So the ability to sort of say what is important about this version of exponential growth, what is important about this graph requires this sort of conceptual processing. All right, so how do you make this more likely to happen in classrooms? Support cognitive mechanisms for relational thinking. And so I'm going to tell you about some studies we've been doing trying to test mechanisms for reducing load. These are strategies that have been used by excellent teachers and also our international counterparts, so teachers in regions that outperform us. And in particular, I'm going to talk about studies on imagery or sort of visual representation and gesture, and in particular, linking gestures. And we're looking at retention and transfer results. Transfer being sort of evidence of flexible relational generalization. And I want to highlight the methodology we've been using. So we've been using a digital video experimental paradigm. And what I mean by that is that we work very closely with the teacher and we create a lesson that is a real lesson taught in a real classroom with, you know, all the craziness that happens in kids. We have lots of videos of kids picking noses and, you know, all sorts of these things. Then we, you know, videotape it simultaneously with multiple cameras. Then we edit these video data to create matched versions with key differences between the conditions. So they always, in our ones, we're really interested in a lot of visual cues and support. So they always have the exact same audio stream, but you can, you know, manipulate what actually is captured in that video. And then we can randomly assign these edited videos to new classrooms of students using them as stimuli. So you can randomly assign within classroom. We do the testing in classrooms, so, you know, with their peers nearby, you know, but they're each at an individual computer, so you have a lot of control about what's happening. So the lesson that we've used a lot, and that I'll be talking about data today, sort of centers on this problem. It's a ratio, rate and ratio kind of a lesson. Ken and Yoko shot several free throws in their basketball game. The result of their shooting is shown on the table. Who's better at shooting free throws? So the common misconception here is that you can just do this by subtracting, so see who missed more. But the, you know, ratio, in order to solve this, you actually need to consider both, you know, how many tries and how many they made. And so this is something we then have students solve however they want, and then we go through and pick 3 solutions. We put them on the board, and then we do sort of, you know, look at different strategies for supporting students and mapping between these strategies. And so to walk you through our methodology, we have a teacher in the front, we have kids sitting here, and we have 3 cameras. So one camera that's at the back of the room and captures everything, one that captures the teacher, and one that captures the students. And there are a couple things that are important here. One is that we were interested in, well, the first video that I'm going to talk about was interested in the difference between seeing everything that's happening versus seeing, you know, sort of certain pieces. So that's why we use the camera, the teacher camera, to zoom in and out. We also use the student camera to, you know, as sort of an alternative view when we wanted to use the videos to, you know, switch away from something that was sort of a crucial, you know, moment of our manipulation. It's also important just in terms of creating video data that are, or video lessons that are interactive enough and interesting enough for students that you want to jump around a little bit. So hand to the student, hand to the teacher. And so we use that, you know, as a tool to keep kids watching. We also use a lot of mics, and this was turned out to be really important. Classrooms are loud, they have lots going on. And so we have a omnidirectional wireless mic on the teacher, boom mic in the back, and then we've done between 1 and 3 boundary mics around the classroom. We also collect audio from the video cameras. So it's a lot of data on one lesson. And then we use Final Cut Pro, and it's got great resources so you can have these multiple videos and, you know, stack them up and use the same audio stream and really be very precise in the way that you're manipulating this. I'll highlight another option, which is Jim Stigler, a video lesson model that Jim Stigler has used, which he's developed this new tool. It's wonderful, Zaption.com. Check it out if you're interested in video. But basically, you can drag in pieces of video, and also you can make them interactive, which I'll highlight in a second. So for the first experiment, we looked at whether these different solutions were not visible at all. So we just zoomed in straight tightly on the teacher and on the student, whether they were all visible at the same time or whether they were visible sequentially, so just one at a time. And I'm not going to run out of time, so I'm not going to show you actually the video, I guess. But here, basically, we also included questions. This is from the Zaption one. But, you know, questions as you're going through the videos, which I think is an important part of keeping students going. You can't have more than like 5 minutes at a time. Okay, so when we look at the data, procedural knowledge, we see really not a lot of difference between having no visual information and having simultaneous visual information, so all visible. Sorry, switch that. So, you know, having everything be visible is actually very different. But when you look at the procedural flexibility, that's where you see the big difference. So you see that the simultaneous, you know, having everything visible is much more important for actually supporting conceptual thinking. So more broad generalizable thinking. Actually, the sequential ended up being the least powerful here, and I think that's because you'd see one thing at a time, And that became really object instantiating. So I was saying relational thinking. We want it to be, or we want math to be relational, right? Moving between these different representations. So they have to be there together in order to make that really salient. And that is what we found, was that people who saw one about visual representation at a time tended to remember those kind of as chunks, including remembering the misconception, which was taught, by itself. Okay, so it seems to matter. But not all visual information is helpful. It can actually increase demands, we think, for inhibitory control maybe, because these object pieces are really salient. Very quickly, we looked at linking gesture as well. Linking gesture being gestures that move between pieces that you want to actually draw students' attention to, so highlighting these relational commonalities. They could be simultaneous like this. They could be linking that move back and forth. We also looked at stereotype threat. So stereotype threat is argued to increase working memory load, and so I told you working memory load is necessary for mapping relational structure. So if you have students who are sitting in the classroom getting the exact same information, they look more like those students seeing the one object, one representation at a time, because they're maybe not having the same working memory resources to actually map these relational structures. We can skip the video because we're going quickly. So when we had no threat, we saw what we expected, which was the gesture would be, leading to greater linking between the representations. And so these are just the data for the conceptual knowledge. The procedural knowledge really didn't show much difference between them. The conceptual knowledge, though, is really, this flexible, generalizable knowledge. But when you have the threat, really that wipes that out mostly. So basically, this suggests that these students, when under stereotype threat, really were not engaging their working memory resources towards relational thinking in the same way. And I think it has really some potentially interesting and important implications for how you can support all students in the classroom, and really being sort of cognizant that maybe from the same information they're actually getting less relational reasoning opportunity from those stimuli. So, but overall, I want to sort of make the motion that digital video is a really wonderful tool for kind of making this bridge between carefully controlled laboratory context and more dynamic, diverse, really variable classroom context. Thanks.
Do you want to take some questions while we set up?
Sure. Yes. It was a pretty minimal one. It was based on my student. I can't remember the exact reference, but it was very minimal. It was professors in the University of Chicago are interested in your performance, and we want to know how all students do learning. And then we had them fill in a demographic form, so we released somebody immediately after that. So we really weren't imposing a stereotype. Sometimes you sort of see the kids impose the stereotype. We didn't do that. Calling attention to it. Yep.
Sorry, I just missed it right at the end there. So when people are actually watching these videos and answering questions, is that something like a Khan Academy framework where we have like a user ID and there's
right, it is a little bit like that. We've done it different ways. So sometimes it's automated in the program. Sometimes it's just a question and they have a paper, that they, solve this problem now, And really we have it engaged in the video. So they're watching students and, so the students are up at the board and I say, do you think that was right? Did you do the same thing as this person? Why do you think they did that? So they're really trained to engage in the video.
Hi, my name is Bethany Teachman. I want to, first of all, thank Justin for putting this presentation together. And following Lindsay, I'm going to ask you to simultaneously see the slides, see me, listen, get the whole thing going on. So I want to talk about Project Implicit Mental Health. It's an online platform to help discover mental health associations that are outside conscious control. And I know we don't have too much time together, but I want to tell you a little bit about why I think implicit associations are particularly important in the psychopathology field, tell you how we're measuring implicit associations. There's lots of different ways, so I'll show you the tasks that we typically use, point out what I think are some of the limits of lab-based studies, and then tell you what we're doing to try to address some of those limitations in terms of work online by introducing you to a website we've launched called Project Implicit Mental Health. So we really became, I'm a clinical psychologist, and we really became interested in better understanding the role of implicit associations in psychopathology because of what we perceive to be sort of mysteries in the clinical field. So why is it that a person with panic disorder who's had, 500 panic attacks over the last 10 years thinks that the 501st is the one that's going to cause a heart attack? How is it that a person who has substance dependence knows that alcohol has cost him his family, his livelihood, his house, all kinds of things, is continuing to drink? The person with body dysmorphic disorder, these individuals have really an obsession with a perceived defect in their appearance. And I've talked to people who haven't left their house for weeks because of concerns about how they look. Why is that? It's hard for us to understand. And I think part of the ways we can understand is by looking at the implicit associations that they have. So we know that the person with panic disorder has an automatic association to associate a heart attack, or with heart racing with a heart attack. That the heavy drinker has self-identity that's closely linked, where they associate the self with being a drinker. The individual with body dysmorphic disorder has associations that their appearance is shameful. And when we talk about implicit associations, we're really talking about automatic associations in memory. And that term automatic is kind of thrown around a little bit too loosely. So when I'm using it, I'm really interested in the features of automaticity are that it's activated rapidly without intentions. The person doesn't have a goal to have these associations activated. And yet, once they're activated, it's difficult to consciously control them. And this idea about the role of implicit associations is actually central to many different models and theories of psychopathology. So schema models, dual process models. You can start to really think of it as a transdiagnostic kind of vulnerability marker. And there's lots of different ways to measure it, but we know that if we want to get a better understanding of implicit associations, we can't just ask people what their thoughts are. It's not going to give us the full picture. So as many of you here probably know, there's lots of different metrics to try to get at this. I'm going to briefly just show you how we've been using the implicit association test in the psychopathology field. For those who aren't familiar, it's a reaction time task that measures the relative strength of associations between constructs. What's interesting to us about it is that it captures these associations that are outside of conscious control and perhaps awareness. So I'll give you an example of some of the ways we've applied it. This is looking at evaluations of the self as calm versus panicked. So on a typical screen, people would see 4 categories that we've placed into 2 pairs. Category panicked is paired with the category not me. Category calm is paired with me. We're not asking individuals whether they think of themselves as somebody who panics or whether they think of themselves as someone who's calm. It's an indirect measure. All they're asked to do is to sort any stimuli that appear in the middle of the screen. If it fits in the category panicked or not me, you're going to stick it on the left side. Fits in the categories calm or me, they're going to stick it on the right side, and we say go as quickly as you can. It's a very simple sorting task. Even kids could do it. So relaxed comes up, fits in the category calm, goes on the right. Self fits in the category me, goes on the right. Afraid would fit in the category panic, goes on the left. And they do a whole bunch of these trials, and then we flip the categories around. Now calm is paired with not me, and panic is paired with me, and they do a whole bunch more classification trials. Now, of course, the order of the category pairing conditions is counterbalanced. And the hypothesis is that if I'm a person who thinks of themselves as really calm and laid back, sadly I'm not, but if I did, I would have a lot of interference in this category pairing condition, right? Because this doesn't match my automatic association memory, so I'm going to go slower compared to the other condition. And sure enough, that's what we see. So this is, for example, one study that we did with individuals with panic disorder compared to a healthy control group. And on the y-axis are the IAT scores, and higher scores here indicate greater self plus calm associations. And what you see is that those with panic disorder are lower on those associations. And those 3 that I oriented, problem areas I oriented you to at the beginning, we've seen that sure enough, people do show implicit associations with appearance with shameful. If they have body dysmorphic disorder, we see a nice dose-response relationship with symptoms. So if you're sub-threshold for the clinical disorder, you have some of that association in between the diagnosed and the control. We've seen it many times with populations that have alcohol dependence, that they have the self plus drinker associations. We've seen it with folks with panic disorder, and we've done this in well over a dozen different populations. So people with height phobias associate heights with fear. People with spider phobia think spiders are dangerous. Blood injection fears, they have disgust associations. It's really quite widespread. We know, fortunately, given these strong ties to psychopathology, that these associations are malleable, however. So, for example, this is one of our earliest studies looking at malleability. We've done a number at this point that just shows you in a snapshot how the associations change from pre to post treatment. So this is spider-phobic individuals relative to a healthy control group. At the outset, you see a big difference, and that's completely wiped out after cognitive behavioral therapy. The therapy was only 3 hours, and yet we can completely wipe that out. And those changes last when we do our follow-up assessments. So, you know, we've learned a lot of things from these lab-based assessments about the importance of implicit associations in the psychopathology field. We know they're tied to numerous forms of psychopathology. We know that they change over treatment. I showed you one example. But we know, for example, from other work that we've done, that the degree of change predicts later symptom reduction. So there's a temporal relationship between change in implicit associations and how much this person is going to get better. We've done dismantling work where we've decomposed the implicit association effects, and we know that with treatment we're actually changing the activation of associations, not just the ability to override. We know that the implicit associations predict lots of disorder-linked behaviors, often even after we control for explicit predictors. So we think these matter, and we've learned a lot about them. But there's also a lot of limitations to what we have learned in the lab, especially when you're working with clinical samples. They are hard to get, and so it's not altogether surprising that we see a lot of very small and very homogeneous samples in these lab-based studies. And, you know, that's a problem with lots of lab-based work. So the things I'm pointing to are certainly not unique to the implicit association research area, but we really do see it come up here. And so in the psychopathology, we've seen that the strength of implicit-explicit relationships are really not reliable across studies. We have no normative estimates of implicit association levels. So many of you have probably taken tests at Project Implicit where there's sort of established levels of what's the norm for a given implicit association. We don't have that kind of equivalent. And perhaps, for me, most consequentially, we've had very minimal chance to look at individual differences as predictors of implicit association levels. We know very little about age, gender, all kinds of different effects. And I think critically, we're also missing an outreach opportunity. So, you know, if you accept sort of the premise I'm suggesting here, that implicit associations really are quite fundamental to psychopathology, people need to know about them because, you know, a quarter to half the population is going to meet diagnostic criteria for a disorder in their lifetime, and people don't know about this major sort of vulnerability marker. And so to start addressing some of these concerns, 2 years ago we launched Project Implicit Mental Health, and it's a website that has both an education and a research mission. We've had well over 130,000 tests administered at this point. It's a public website where people can go and learn about implicit association research. They can get mental health resources, and critically, they can go and try some of these tests. So it's at www.implicitmentalhealth.com. Go check it out. Send people to it if you're clinical. Send your patients to try it out. And we have lots of different tasks up there tied to many different mental health domains. So depression, self-esteem, alcohol concerns, eating disorder concerns, stigma of mental illness, anxiety, attitudes towards treatment, self-harm and suicide implicit associations. And people can go and pick what they want to try and learn about their own associations, and we give them feedback about their scores on these measures, so they get some learning as well. So because we don't have too much time, I just picked 4 of the tasks to show you some of the kinds of data that we're seeing. So I picked anxiety, where we have 21,000 people who've done this task. This is looking at associations with the self being anxious versus calm. Depression, looking at associations with the self being sad versus happy. Alcohol, where we're going for the self identity, looking at associations with the self as a drinker versus abstaining, and in eating concerns IAT, which looks at the associations between high-fat foods as being shameful versus acceptable. And the particular associations we picked are each based on sort of classic theories in each of those disorder fields about the types of associations you would expect to be problematic. In addition to completing the implicit association measure, each person completed a well-established symptom measure in that domain, and they also completed what we're calling an explicit association measure. These were just 2 semantic differential items that were parallel in form to the implicit association test. So it would ask for the anxiety one, to what extent do you associate yourself as anxious versus calm? And they would indicate that on a Likert scale, and then how do you associate others as anxious versus calm? Take the difference between them, and that way we have a nice sort of relative comparison. So one of our key questions was how would the implicit-explicit relationships, what would they look like when we could get a more reliable estimate than we get in the lab? Because as I said, these have sort of fluctuated across studies quite a bit with the small samples. And what you see in that first column is the association between the IAT and that semantic differential measure, the explicit associations. And across the different self-associations, regardless of the disorder, they're actually pretty comparable in magnitude, which was interesting. Same thing when we look at the association between the implicit measure and the symptom measure. Again, very comparable sort of magnitude of associations. The eating one is a slightly smaller relationship there. A couple of reasons why that could be. It's the only one that is an association tied to the self, which is interesting. So it may be sort of conceptually elaborated in different ways. There may be some sample-specific factors as well that I'm happy to talk about if we have time. For interest sake, I also put up the association between the explicit association and the symptom measure, and as you would expect, that's going to be a little bit higher. Those share tons of method variance. They're both asking, hey, how do you think of yourself as anxious? So it'd be kind of weird if they weren't nicely related. So what we see is among these sort of implicit measures with the explicit ones, we have some overlap, suggesting that they are tapping into something meaningful, but they are also, reflecting different aspects of the construct, and we see them predicting different kinds of things as well. I picked just a few of the individual different measures to show you. We see small effects with age, so in general, it's one of the few good things about getting older is that your negative implicit associations are going to be a little bit lower. So you have slightly lower anxiety associations, depression associations. Unfortunately, your associations with high-fat food as being shameful grow, although I should be careful. This is cross-sectional data, so I shouldn't be speaking about it longitudinally. But yeah, that's worse. We see very little from the standpoint of education effects. Small effects that there's a protective factor of education for implicit anxiety and depression, but pretty small. And gender was interesting. So gender, we replicate the sort of standard effects on symptom measures that you see for alcohol being higher in men, anxiety and eating concerns being higher in women. But interestingly, and this was a surprise to us, and we have 24,000 people on the depression task, so we've got a decent sample size. We see no relationship, and almost anything is significant with 24,000 people. So it's, we're really not seeing it there, which is interesting, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts during the question and answer period about why that might be. We're also not seeing strong ethnicity effects, so Hispanic relative to non-Hispanic, very little difference on these tasks. Some of that matches what you see in the explicit literature, and some of it contradicts it. So this may be that these tools are capturing something that's a little bit different in terms of how it relates to different cultural variables. So I've just given you sort of a little teaser of the kinds of things that we're seeing at the site. I just want to let you know in terms of what's next. Right now, what I've shown you is sort of the assessment phase of this work, but what we're building right now is an intervention arm. So people who score highly on these measures will then be invited to participate in to be randomized to different intervention conditions, and we're doing cognitive bias modification approaches where we're going to try to train different thinking patterns with these individuals so that the individual with panic disorder can start to associate their heart racing with being all right, the drinker can associate themselves with abstaining, and our person with body dysmorphic disorder can start to see their appearance as more acceptable. And hopefully I'll have a chance to come back and share the results of that work with you at another APS. But for now, I want to thank you very much for your attention.
Novice nuts and bolts.
No, please. I like those.
How do you control for internet latency when you are getting return latency measures as your dependent variable? So, the latency of any given internet connection may be anywhere from whatever 10 milliseconds up to 1,000 milliseconds. If you're getting people to click on those through a website, is there some way that you know that you're able to control for the latency of the individual? Or the connections at the individual level?
Yeah, I mean, I know that we have recommendations about browsers you can use and things like that, but I don't know specifically an answer to your question. It hasn't been a huge problem in this work. We've been getting pretty reliable results, but it's a good question.
Well, it may also be when you get, because I know people who do this kind of thing, the sample sizes that they're using are relatively small. It may just be that when you get up to an N of 20,000 or whatever the number is, that the variability in the individual level internet connections effectively block.
That may be, but in other, we've done lots of online studies, though. And another work that we've done where we are doing smaller experimental studies where we only have 50 people per condition randomized stuff, we're also seeing results. So I'd be happy if you want to give me your email to follow up with you, and I can get a better answer to your question about exactly how that's being managed. Yeah, drop me an email, please.
So I understand that you let the participants know what their implicit association score was and then feedback. Did you also tell them what their explicit measure score was?
We're not right now. We have about 12 disclaimers on the site that we are not doing a formal diagnosis. We have links to all kinds of mental health resources, though, on the site to access therapy in their area and hotlines and all kinds of things. At the moment, we're not. When we do the intervention arm, we will be doing that where we'll give people progress, because it's going to be a multi-session intervention. We'll give people progress on changes in their symptoms and have a monitoring system so that people will be called out of the study for seeing worsening of symptoms and things like that. So yeah, we really went back and forth on that. We decided that for now, for the demonstration and educational purposes, we were not going to give them that information on their scores. But we decided instead that our approach from a sort of ethics standpoint and outreach standpoint was that we give every single person resources. So part of the debriefing page, we have it set up so they actually give people a choice of whether they want to get their scores or not, because we recognize that for some individuals.
But not for that.
Right. Right. Instead, we say, if you have any concerns about your mood, about your health, here's a link to the resources. So what we decided to do was just make it super accessible for everybody and let them choose rather than kind of, without being able to debrief in person.
Yeah.
So that's how we chose to handle it. It's a good question. And do we have time, Joseph, or should we be moving on?
Let's get Sharon. Maybe you can bring it up.
Okay, good. Please come ask me afterwards. So.
Or type it into tiny.cc symposium behavior online.
That too. Well, I think it's very appropriate that I get to follow Bethany because I think we're concerned with very similar kinds of things, which is, first of all, the fact that I'm really short, and so you might not be able to see me, but really promoting thriving. And the context in which we look at this is in schools. And so, as a goal as a country and really around the world, our goal for students in school is both that they perform well, but also that they have positive well-being while they're in the school. And that we know that a number of different things can actually challenge that potential for students to thrive. Some of them are structural, some of them have to do with how good the curriculum is, how good the pedagogy is, whether students have the financial resources to really be able to focus on school or not, but also some of them are psychological and have to do with the ways in which students are thinking about themselves and their context. So stereotype threat was mentioned already. You might worry whether you might have the potential to be seen through the lens of a negative stereotype. You might just be anxious about performing well and wanting to do well. You might not feel like you're smart enough. There's a number of different negative interpretations that you might have that could get in the way of you thriving. And so my work really looks at how we can build adaptive mindsets so that students can thrive as best as possible in those situations. And what we know is that mindsets can come from a number of different places. They can come from personality, they can come from past experiences, they can come from family and friends. They can also come from school and from the institutions that we're embedded in. And when we think about students thriving, we have to think about the fact that these are students embedded in context. And so certainly another place that students are getting thoughts about how they should and how they could think in a situation are from the institution itself. And now with online communication happening so much between the teacher and the institution and the students, online channels might actually be a very rich and powerful way to help shape students' mindsets. And so if you think about the number of different ways that an institution might communicate with its students online, here's just a few of the different ones that you might see. So schools have websites, and they have web portals where you have to check your grades, register for your classes. You get emails from administrators, emails from instructors, you get emails from listservs. You have to fill out forms online at times, and sometimes schools also send surveys out. So there's a number of different ways that schools and institutions are actually having the potential to shape the ways in which students are thinking. And so the research that I'm going to talk about today is just a couple of different experiments that we've done to try and leverage these online communication channels to be able to promote student success.
So my name is Shannon Brady, and I'm a doctoral student at Stanford, and I do want to recognize that there's been an incredible number of people who have been a part of the projects I'm going to talk about today, and ones that are very similar that I won't have a chance to talk about. So all of these people have contributed in one way or another. And the two interventions that I'm going to talk about today use different channels. The first one focuses on the student's transition to college and looks at an intervention embedded in a form that students had to fill out. And then the second one looks at test anxiety and uses an email from an instructor right before they took the exam. So when we think about the transition to college, it's certainly an exciting time for students, but it can also be an anxiety-provoking time, and it can be a difficult time when students actually get to college. What we know from prior research is that that transition can be very stressful. And then it can be particularly stressful for students who come from backgrounds or have identities where they might wonder whether they're going to be negatively stereotyped or whether they're going to just simply be able to make it in college. And so they might wonder whether they're really going to fit in and be accepted socially, but also academically. And so building on some past research by Greg Walton and Jeff Cohen, we wanted to see if we could have the opportunity to give students sort of a roadmap of where they were headed transition to college, and to let them know that difficulties in the transition to college are normal and that nearly all students experience them, and with time, nearly everyone overcomes those worries about whether they belong and finds their place in college. And so online affords a really exciting opportunity because somewhat like this had been done in the lab, but it was one-on-one. We can distill this into something that can be put online. We're able to reach actually 90% of the incoming class at an institution with this particular study. And so what it was is in the transition to college, students have to fill out a number of different forms, health forms, write a letter to your future roommate, upload a photo for your student ID, and right after upload a photo for your student ID was our form, Form 15, which was clearly marked as optional, but was about social and academic life at the institution. And there were 4 different conditions. There was a control condition that talked about it was standard information about coming to college and having to get oriented to the physical environment, and then 3 different treatment conditions. I'm not going to describe a lot about the differences there. I can at the end if we have time, but let me show you just kind of how students got into our study and into this intervention. And so this was Form 15. Go ahead and follow the link. As soon as students followed the link, they ended up at a Qualtrics survey that was our intervention. And what the students then saw was they saw results from what we call the current student survey, which shared information about what past students had said the transition to college was like. Then they saw quotations that elaborated on the main findings of the survey. And finally, they wrote what we call a saying is believing essay, sort of a self-persuasive essay where students talk about why might this be common for all students to worry, and how might they deal with those kinds of worries if they were to arise for them. So let me show you just some of what our materials looked like. So this was the front page. You're in, you're coming, you're excited, you might have questions. This is going to answer some of those questions that you might have. The current student survey, this is for the belonging condition, but for all of the conditions it looks somewhat like this, sharing slightly different information. What did students say? Well, they said that they worried about whether students would accept them. They worried whether others would view their abilities negatively. What did they discover? With time, they came to feel like they belonged. And then you can see the conclusions there. So this is what students are filling out on their own laptops the summer before they come to college. So this is done in the matriculation materials. Most of it was done in June. Nearly all students completed the materials in June. So this is before they've even come to the institution. After they see this, then they see these kinds of quotes. When I think back to the summer before I came to the school, I was incredibly excited about coming to the school, was also somewhat intimidated. Walking into classes for the first time freshman year was uncomfortable, especially small classes. But now I feel much more relaxed. I realize that everybody has a common goal, and so on. And so this is what's the experience that students are having at their own homes. And then what's really exciting about doing this kind of a project embedded in an institution is that we can actually then just collect information from the institution on how students are doing later in the year. And so we looked at the end of students' freshman year of college, and our prediction was that you wouldn't get much of a benefit from sharing additional materials about what it looks like to come to the campus. That's kind of the things that students already get in their pre-matriculation information. But this kind of information that really helps students reframe the meaning of adversity and see a trajectory in which they can belong in college, that should be very helpful, particularly for students from backgrounds where they might wonder whether they really fit in the institution. So in terms of results, let me show you what we got first for what we're going to call advantage students. And advantage students in this particular school context, and I can talk more about how we came up with that, are white continuing gen students and all Asian students. And what we see is that students who are advantaged are doing quite well in this institutional context. These are raw means on first year GPA. They have about 3.62 if they're in the control, no difference if they're in the treatment. Now I'm going to show you what we see for the prior 2 years. So these are non-randomized students. They're disadvantaged, so that's Black students, Latino students, Native students, Pacific Islander students, and all first-generation students. See if we can get it to go in the right order. No. All right. Well, so in the two bars in the middle are the prior years, so that's non-randomized, and then the control. And we see that in the past, disadvantaged students were not doing particularly well, and in the control, we see the same thing. But then the next 4 bars are the 3 treatments, and you can see that in all of the treatments, we see this increase in how well students are doing in their freshman year of college. And the last one is kind of the combined treatment. So we see a significant increase in how students are doing, performing on their first year GPA, if they've seen this information, helping them frame the transition to college. And we see that even when we control for prior academic achievement, prior class rank, and gender as well. And the reduction that we get in the achievement gap between advantaged students and disadvantaged students for the raw means is about 35%, and for the adjusted means is about 53%. When we think about thriving, though, we're not just wanting to help students improve their GPA. We really want to help students be more socially integrated on campus. And so we also were able to do a survey with students at the end of the year and get about 30% of students to graciously take our survey. And what we measured was social and academic engagement. We indexed this with 4 different constructs. One was simply how many close friends do you have and how close are your relationships with those friends. The next one was how willing are you to use academic support services. The next one was whether you have a mentor on campus, and then how involved in extracurriculars do you have. And so since they were all on different metrics, I have Z-scores here. And so what you see is for advantaged students, there's certainly a mean trend that this was positive, but it's non-significant. And then for disadvantaged students, those who are in the treatment are much more likely to have a mentor on campus, to have close friends, to be involved in extracurricular activities. And so we can see how shaping how students think in that transition to college can play out for very powerful consequences, both in terms of how students are performing, but also the experiences that they're having. So that's the first intervention that we did. The second intervention, we wanted to help students think more productively about exams. And what we know is that tests can cause stress and emotion, and it can cause both physiological arousal, but also worries about anxiety. And past research has shown that actually the physiological arousal isn't the part that causes negative performance, it's the worries about anxiety. And so we thought that cognitive reappraisal, helping students rethink about the emotions that they were having, could be a very powerful strategy. And so we did this in an introductory psychology course with about 430 students, half of whom were freshmen, and they simply got an email before exam 1, this was standard practice for this course, reminding students that in fact they did have an exam the next day and they should bring their number 2 pencil. And all we did is we embedded an extra paragraph in that email. So this is the one for the reappraisal students. And what's highlighted in the blue box is what we added. So all students kind of got as you know, your first midterm is tomorrow, and here's some specific details. But in the reappraisal condition, we were trying to help them think about that anxiety more productively, and so we simply said, People think that feeling anxious while taking a test will make them do poorly. However, recent research suggests that arousal doesn't generally hurt performance and can even help performance. If you find yourself feeling anxious, simply remind yourself that your arousal could be helping you well. And then again, we just have this really exciting opportunity to collect the outcome from the course itself. So the very next day, students take the exam, and we predicted that this wouldn't be that helpful for upperclassmen who already sort of know how to take exams in school, and this is not known as a particularly difficult class. And what we see is that, in fact, on the first exam, there's no difference for upperclassmen, but for freshmen there is a significant difference, such that the reappraisal message improves students' exam performance the next day by about 2.5 percentage points. We then look to see, does this persist throughout the course? If doing better on that first exam actually gets us to doing better in the course. In fact, what we found for upperclassmen, the answer is no. And for freshmen, no, the answer is yes. And this is about the difference between a B+ and an A- in the course. Thinking about why this might have happened, we also had the opportunity to measure students' feelings at the time of exam 1. There was no differences between the reappraisal and the control condition and anxiety. We reported the same levels of anxiety, but students in the freshman reappraisal condition had lower worries about anxiety and higher confidence while they were taking the exam. And what we find is that confidence mediates the relationship between the condition and their final grade. We did partial out exam 1 from the final grade. It works whether you have that partialed out or not. So let me just give 1 or 2 final comments. One is that we're finding that this is a really useful paradigm, so we're being able to do this in some other avenues in the institution. And so one thing we're getting to look at is when students get notified that they haven't made sufficient academic progress, that can be a very stigmatizing experience for students. Might there be ways to just tweak some of the language in that notification to make it feel less stigmatizing and help students work more productively forward? We also know that sometimes women in computer science tend to disengage and opt out, and we're doing an intervention right now that shows that suggests trying to replicate that having the instructor email jokes before the exams might build a little bit of relationship between the instructor, the male instructors, and the female students, and we're seeing positive trends right now for that intervention. A few challenges that we have seen is, one, just do students read this stuff? It's a reasonable question. If they're not reading the stuff, though, we would expect that our effect sizes are actually underestimated, or our effects are underestimated rather than overestimated. So we're certainly trying to figure out more about how we can tease that apart. But if anything, it should be working against us, not working for us. It's difficult to collect evidence of mechanism, but certainly something that we're working on. We want to be able, over time, to figure out what works for whom and when, and really be able to figure that out. And then finally, I just want to make sure that a challenge that we've had is in talking about this, because I don't think we want to say that this should be done instead of traditional education reforms. That certainly we need to think about the pedagogy and we need to think about financial resources for students, but this is another way to be able to really promote student thriving. And so it's not an either or. Either do these interventions that can promote more adaptive mindsets or do more traditional ones, but really we should be trying to do them together and possibly coming up with some synergistic effects. And so I will end there. Thank you very much. Yeah. Any questions while Traj gets up here?
I have a question.
Yeah. Let me go this way so I can
So
kind of
the
see.
survey that they do,
Yes.
the ostensible survey that they're doing when they're getting that information, is to some extent some deception.
Yeah, so we have collected information from the institution such that that information is consistent with what
So
students at the
so
institution.
So debriefing issues, because you really want to follow them. You don't
Yeah,
want them to be
so
told,
we're-
actually this wasn't really real.
Right. So we're very careful in the way that we have crafted it, and so we say a few things. One is that we make sure that it is consistent with information we've collected at the institution, and then we also say that the quotations have been edited for clarity, and I can't remember the second word that we have, but so we have to do like clever word choice things to be able to get around that particular issue.
Okay. Excuse me. Hi, I'm Traj Al-Ahmad, and I'm not a psychologist, but I played one for parts of my dissertation. My research is in HCI, which blends behavioral psychology, design, and computing. And so I'm coming from a little different perspective. I'm going to try to attempt to be provocative. I think we have about 7 minutes, so I'll go quickly through the themes, some of the themes we heard, and then speculate on how they situate into broader trends and opportunities that they present for the future. So one theme was around the benefits of the lab. Joseph highlighted. You can instrument to get all the data you need, control and precision of what's going on, and it yields generalizable theories. But Bethany and Lindsay highlighted some of the limits with the small homogeneous samples, hard to estimate norms because it's not the setting that the ecological setting. There's little data on which to evaluate individual differences. There's a missed opportunity for outreach because what you're doing is just in your laboratory setting. And you're missing factors from the real world that interact with what you're observing. Those may be significant things that are happening in the real environment that are relevant to what you think is happening. And another theme was around opportunities to digitize the real world. So let the real world continue being the real world and put instruments in it like video cameras that you can then take in the lab to do more detailed sorts of analyses. This leaves out, and also being able to do it across diverse geography with the video footage from the different classrooms in US, Hong Kong, and Japan. But how do you manipulate those environments? And so that's one of the advantages of the online setting. Another theme was around the transfer model of the idea that you take what you find in a laboratory setting and then figure out how to move it into the real world. In education, there's this big problem with this, like the What Works Clearinghouse finds that does these multi-million-dollar randomized control trials to see, like, let's scale it up, and it just doesn't work. So sometimes trying to take it from one context and the other just doesn't work. So one of the opportunities in laboratories in the real world is, what if we did the research in the fully external world to start with instead of trying to transfer it? Another thing that was in all the work was around the social impact. And it was really nice to see a couple of these studies where the subjects in the studies received the benefits of the research directly and immediately, like with the students getting the gains and the GPA raises. That was really impressive. And that after the Stanford administrators, you said that after a couple of years, maybe this is when I talked to you earlier.
Yeah. So because of the results that we were able to show in the study, we actually have the institution is adopting that there's no longer going to be a control condition, but everyone is going to get a treatment condition. We're still looking at differences between treatment conditions, but then every student has the opportunity to be in one of the conditions.
Right, so that's a really nice advantage of this work. There's also another thing that came up in the discussion was that Stanford would only allow certain manipulations. So when you're doing this work in the real world, there's a lot more constraints in the real world. You're dealing with lots of other people. You're dealing with cultural and technological limitations of what you might want to be doing. So in your work with the MOOClets, you were able to control the whole experience. But then when you want to do it with Khan Academy, it has to be constrained by their aims. When I like to raise the question, if it doesn't fit into the real world for your research, will it ever fit into the real world? And so this is a question you're answering useful. Yeah, okay, covered that. So this is what I like to say is the big trend that we capitalize on for research is Mark Andreessen, Netscape co-founder and now big venture capitalist. He's invested in software because software is eating the world. Lots of things that weren't software are becoming software. Taxi cabs are on Uber. Everything's on Google. And this is happening slowly, but like I think of it as kind of like glacier breaking off in education and healthcare. Like it's going to change rapidly once it starts happening, where these institutions will be computer mediated or at least computer supported, meaning that the computer is part of the process, because we don't want to all just be interacting with screens. So in healthcare and education, much of the research is in order to improve those systems. And I asked, should we be working more directly towards those improvements? In the slides, at least in early version, you had that there's minimal spillover from the lab to the real world settings. And that's a very kind of passive frame to how the research gets into practice. So I asked whether we should have our research be more action-oriented. So software is creating new opportunities for researchers to be stakeholders in the design process, and should behavioral scientists find a voice in how systems are designed? So I'll go, okay, really quickly. I'd like to advocate that scientists and technologists can work together to build research probes with the dual goals of understanding the world and improving it. And I offer this term of an operant probe, which is a product that operates in the liminal context between research and practice, that you can be, as a researcher, you can work with people who are making things that are used in the real world as is, and manipulate those things both for the ends of improving the use and helping the people who are using it, and also for developing generalizable models that can be used in further designs. And I think that leaves about a minute for questions.
I guess one question I have for any speaker is that I really liked what you touched on in your last talk, which was really that, you know, sometimes to enjoy the advantages of working with online methods, you have to use someone else's system, because they already have the Blockbuster video game or website and whatnot. You want to work within that, but then there's this kind of possibility for some kind of partnership and development of a product. But one issue, of course, is that with these kinds of industry basic research collaborations, is that the applied research industry have, you know, deep turnarounds on their research projects, right? At least, yeah, to my understanding, right? And so I think it's still really hard to get those data, right? I mean, so there is still this tension between, do you want to work within the constraints of somebody else's system, potentially get better samples, bigger samples, and all that stuff, or do you want to try and build the Blockbuster system on your own, and then you get more control, but you know, it's so. I wonder if there's some methodological principle that you feel should be driving our choice there, or whether it should just be do whatever you can do.
I think we go back to the old adage that hopefully all of us learned in our first research methods. It's multi-trait, multi-method. We need convergent approaches. I don't think it's an either-or question. I think they both tell us, you know, it's the classic internal-external validity kind of trade-off. It's all, you know, so I think we need both.
My experience has been that it's not so much a methodological constraint as an information flow constraint, as in you just have to figure out who the right people to partner with. One thing I would say is that the reason I'm trying to create these MOOClets is that now universities have a platform. So I'm not sure what university you're at, but increasingly they move towards it. Or you can partner with a university person. So I'm happy to talk about that, but maybe it's embedded, or just create your own, you know. Any other questions? Well, thanks so much for coming up. I really appreciate it.
Nice summary. Very nice summary. And I think you're totally right. It is really